Now, Antiochus IV, he started this, and he had Jews who were cooperating, going along with him. And others were beginning to rebel and to resist. And the resistance led to a lot of pain and suffering. Then Antiochus IV felt that he was all ready, and he was going to invade Egypt and conquer Egypt. That campaign had a very interesting result. It's about 170, 169. Antiochus IV marches to the conquest of Egypt, and nobody resists him. He marches through Israel, crosses the Sinai Desert. The Egyptians cannot stop him, and he's on his way to Alexandria. He's on his way to Alexandria when suddenly a small group of men are standing in the road, and they tell him to stop. The man standing there says to him, "I represent the Roman Senate, and our message to you is that you don't conquer Egypt, but turn around and go back." And Antiochus says to him, "And who's going to stop me?" He said, "A Roman army, which is behind me, and they're now approaching." And this confrontation goes on for a short time, and then this Roman has the gall to say, "I'm drawing this circle around you, and you're going to make a decision before you step out of this circle to go back." Antiochus thinks and considers and is wondering what's going to happen. And he turns around and says to his army, "Okay, back home." This Roman with chutzpah, total gall, did it all on his own. He knew that eventually the Romans would come in and drive him back. But in the meantime, he actually bluffed him into retreating. In the meantime, this Roman had sent letters to Rome saying, "This guy wants to conquer Egypt, we better stop him." But at the time it happened, he was all on his own. He and a couple of other men of the embassy. Now, on his way back, Antiochus is going through Israel, so he goes into Jerusalem, and he plunders the temple. I mean, even the fact that they already had idols, and they simply emptied the treasury, and he was frustrated and angry and returned home. And in the meantime, the Jewish rebellion begins to increase. Now we have the Maccabean rebellion breaking out. And the Maccabean rebellion is a rebellion led by these 5 brothers, the sons of Mattatyahu Hashmonai, Mattathias, who was a displaced priest. In other words, there are several priestly families in Israel. One of them had been the family of the priest in Jerusalem until Antiochus IV came in. And that family, of course, exiled itself to Egypt under Onias III. Then another priestly family came in. The Hasmoneans were another priestly family that was dispossessed from the temple. They were not in the temple. They lived in the city of Modin, south of Jerusalem. And they started the rebellion against the paganism which was taking place in Jerusalem. And the leader of the rebellion was Judah Maccabee. So we call it the Maccabean Rebellion. Judah Maccabee started a war against the Emperor Antiochus IV. And this has happened in history before. Antiochus IV had the largest army, the biggest military force. The Maccabees fought a little guerrilla warfare on a small scale, but they were constantly inflicting pain and suffering on the armies of Antiochus. So it's a classic example of a guerrilla force fighting against a big power and, as we'll see eventually, emerging victorious. By the way, it's interesting, the rebellion of Judah Maccabee started against the priests in Jerusalem. It didn't start against Antiochus. It starts out as their rebellion saying, "You have contaminated the temple in Jerusalem, we want it cleaned." The notion of fighting for independence never entered their minds. No. They just resented the fact that the temple had been contaminated by the pagan intrusions. So they were fighting against the priests in Jerusalem. When Judah Maccabee began to inflict pain on the pagan syncretists in Jerusalem, they called upon the emperor to defend them. That's when Antiochus sent in an army to defend the pagan priests in Jerusalem against Judah Maccabee. He sent in an army thinking, well, my armies are well organized. They follow the Alexandrian pattern of the Macedonian phalanx. I mean, we are the most advanced army. But, Judah Maccabee doesn't meet them head on. He attacks them from secret, from behind. He attacks them from the sides. He comes out from the forests and from the caves. They were not able to get him. And he defeated an army of Antiochus. That's when Antiochus decides to send in another army. And Judah Maccabee, by the way, while he is conducting this, is also studying the Greek tactics. And he is following them, and he has his men spying and following the armies as they are moving through the country. At one particular encounter, at a place called Emmaus, Judah Maccabee encounters a significant Greek force, and he has his men prepared on the sides, forests, and behind rocks and so on, and the force keeps coming, and he attacks at the critical moment, and he defeats this army. A Greek force of Antiochus comes in, and at the town of Emmaus, or near the town of Emmaus, Judah Maccabee annihilates them, just annihilates them. And when he does, he has a clear road to Jerusalem. Nobody can stop him. So he goes on to Jerusalem, and he takes control of the city. First thing he does when he takes control of the city is to drive the pagans out of the temple, remove all of the statues and contamination, cleanse the place, and says to the people of Jerusalem, we're going to rededicate the temple. And he establishes this festival, which is called Hanukkah, which means dedication. And he says, we're going to celebrate this for 8 days, and they rededicate the temple. Now, that was the great victory. It's not the end of the war, by the way. It's just a victory, but a very important one. However, it's important for another reason. The Romans are aware of this. And so they send a delegation to Jerusalem. And they say to Judah Maccabee, we are your friends and allies, and we will defend you. And I think it's time for us to really get together. And we would like to have you send a delegation to Rome. So Judah Maccabee sends 2 ambassadors to Rome. They come to Rome, and the Roman Senate hails them as the great heroes of Judean independence. Judah Maccabee never thought of independence. But this is what the Romans are saying, that you are now in the position where you can cut yourself off from the empire of Antiochus. You know what the Romans wanted. They wanted to weaken Antiochus as much as they could, whatever they could do. Here was an opportunity for the Romans. The next thing you know, the Romans draw up a mutual defense treaty between the Jews and the Romans. That treaty, by the way, is recorded in the book of Maccabees, chapter 8. It's a full-fledged mutual defense treaty between the Romans and the Jews. And the Jews established an embassy in Rome. It's 161 BC. That's the beginning of the Jewish community of Rome, 161 BC. And the Jewish community of Rome has continued unbroken down to the present day. Now, Judah Maccabee now has a mutual defense pact with the Romans. But it's interesting the way it says, if Rome is attacked, the Jews will come to the defense of Rome. If Judah is attacked, the Romans will come to the defense of the Jews. They didn't. They didn't because they didn't have to. Judah Maccabee continued to win small victories and to remain on top of the situation. But what they did do is the Romans sent a letter to the emperor, who was no longer Antiochus IV. He had died. He was succeeded by Demetrius. And the Romans sent a letter to Demetrius saying, we are friendly with the Jews, and you have committed aggression against them, and we warn you, if you should commit aggression against the Jews, we will come to their aid, according to our mutual defense pact, which we have with them. That letter is interesting because it's a warning. The Romans never did have to do that because the Jews managed to maintain themselves. And not only that, because of the Maccabean rebellion, the Seleucid Empire begins to crack. And it begins to crack because others in the Seleucid Empire realize that Antiochus has lost his battles. He lost the invasion of Egypt. His armies were defeated by Judah Maccabee. And so rivals begin to arise, and then there is a civil war breaking out in the Seleucid Empire. In the meantime, the war goes on. By the way, when we speak of the Maccabean rebellion, if you've ever heard that, what we call a thumbnail sketch of the Maccabean rebellion, the Jews fought for their freedom. They fought to cleanse the temple. They cleansed the temple. They lit the candles. Instead of a bottle for one day, it burned for 8 days. That was the miracle. They celebrated Hanukkah, and that's the end of the story. That's not the story. No, when you read the history, that's not what happened. The war of the Maccabees against the Seleucid Empire went on for 20 years. It was a bloody, horrible war. Now, the war lasted for a long time. And in the course of the war, of the 5 brothers, Judah Maccabee and his 5 brothers, 4 were killed. Judah Maccabee also. The one who remained was Simon. Simon was now the leader of the rebellion. But in the meantime, there was a civil war going on in Syria, in the Seleucid Empire, and one of the participants appealed to the Maccabee brothers, to Simon, for help, in effect recognizing Israel as an independent state. So in effect, you could say that the independent state of Israel, which we call the second Jewish commonwealth of the Hasmonean dynasty, becomes an independent Jewish state in about 155 BC. About 155 BC, an independent Jewish state emerges in the land of Israel.